Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Mind Over Chatter podcast, where Central Michigan University counselors discuss topics centered around the life of a CMU student, discover skills and strategies to navigate life's challenges, and thrive as a CMU student. I'm your host, Kyleigh Ayala, and with me today, I have Kevin Vaillancourt and Kate Ridenour. Before we jump into the episode, I want to take a minute for both of you to introduce yourselves.
Hi, like you said, my name is Kevin Vaillancourt. I've been a counselor for a little over 8 years, but I just joined CMU this past fall.
As you said, my name is Kate Ridenour. I have been in the counseling center for about 2 years now and have been a counselor for about 2.5 years practicing.
Thank you both for being here with us today. On today's episode, we have another interesting and informative topic. We're going to be discussing impulsive reactions versus thoughtful communications. Can you remember a time when you made a decision or responded when your emotions were heightened or elevated? By saying something that you regretted or wished you wouldn't have? Maybe your roommate ate your food or didn't clean up after themselves, something that is uncharacteristic of your normal response. What was the outcome of that decision? Do you wish that you could have reacted in a different way? Do you wish that you would have allowed yourself to process emotions before making a decision? Did it negatively impact you or those around you? If you answered yes to any of these questions, it might mean that you are operating from a reactive thinking lens rather than a logical one. So what does operating from a reactive lens mean? Essentially, our stress response is fired, which is how we give and receive communication. This includes reading facial cues, understanding words, tone of voice, body language. Our stress response is a biological process that triggers a systemic response designed to save our lives if we were in danger. You might have heard of the fight or flight response. It's survival of the species. This happens because we need the energy and functioning to survive if we encounter danger. We have to decide as an individual if we fight or flee, and we have to have the energy and functioning to be able to do either. The challenge with this biological process is it happens because our bodies cannot distinguish the difference between encountering a bear or a fight with a friend. The physical response is going to be the same. It's our job to tell our body how we want it to respond. Teaching our brain how to respond is the same way athletes teach their bodies how to train in order to perform, to compete. So passing it over to my co-hosts, how does the body work when stress responses are fired?
Well, with stress being biologically driven, when you're stressed, you're fired up. What's the issue here? Are you not focused on logical? Are you misreading what you're seeing in someone's facial cues or other body language? Or is there a thought of maybe a potential danger? You're assuming the negative, the worst case scenario, because this is you in a heightened sense. Self-preservation is key. That's when you're not thinking logically, you're thinking survive.
And in terms of the actual physiological part of that, to add on to what Kevin's saying, the way I like to think about it is we have a piece of our brain, the amygdala, that is constantly scanning the environment for dangers. That's, in the past, we were trying to survive, and there were real predators and life-threatening situations. That was his job, was to constantly scan the environment, whether we're conscious of it or not. And if it noticed something that was triggering a sense of danger, then we'd get that adrenaline response, right? That stress response. In that response, the prefrontal cortex, our more logical thinking part of our brain, kind of shuts down. We go to the emotional response. Everything is focused on trying to survive, whether that's fight, flight, or flee, as you said, or freeze, I should say, rather than flee. And so that's a piece of this, like you said, something in the environment, the perception, right? We could be stressed, and so something somebody says automatically takes us to that place, right? It can be the one thing that takes us over to the edge and creates that response. But I think the important piece in what we're talking about today is understanding the response, and then I know we'll get to how to actually calm that response and understand that response to slow that down a little bit.
And I think, too, like you've mentioned, there are a bunch of different reasons why people might act this way. Yes, there's the biological component of that, but then viewing it from a, biopsychosocial model of you have like biology, you have social in terms of like environmental, and then you have the psyche. What are some possible reasons why individuals react impulsively?
You have initial thoughts based on past experiences, impulsivity, your perceptions, black and white thinking. There's so many different things that can trigger it, but it all goes back to our past experiences and how we've responded and what's worked for us. And that becomes basically a conditioned response.
And I think the perception piece is so important, especially if, we're talking about impulsive reactions and thoughtful communication. So like when emotions are aroused or we're in a situation that's triggering, or if like a stress response is triggered, it's subjective to the individual because we all perceive our reality different. So I don't know if you guys want to dive a little deep into that as well, about like how important is perception, or what does perception look like? Like I know you mentioned like it's rooted or it's grounded in past experiences, maybe conditioned responses. I don't know if there was anything else that you wanted to add to that.
I would say just try to normalize it a bit, because we all have these perceptions based on our past, our experiences. Some are good, correct, healthy, whatever word you choose. Some of them are maybe not so healthy, and they can be changed. It just takes time.
To add on to what you're saying, we learn how to respond in situations based on our past history, right? So if something, whether or not it's accurate, is similar to a past experience, we're going to register as that as, oh, this sounds similar to this situation where this happened in a previous relationship or an upbringing or something like that, in a parental relationship or something like that. And so it registers it that way, or can. And so we have that response, whether or not that's accurate. And so we can tend to misread the situation and have that natural response of, well, this is similar to when that happened, so now I'm going to respond the same way. But as we're talking about, the more that you practice that awareness piece, the more you can realize, yes, that was based on past history, but that doesn't mean that what's happening now is the same as what was happening then, and to try to change that path as we've been talking about.
And I think that's important too, like what you touched on is like your past experiences and how they influence current behaviors, because I think people tend to underestimate that, or they're operating through this lens of, this is normal for me, this is comfortable, like my body knows this experience, this feeling, and this is what we've always done. And I know, Kevin, you talked about like normalizing it. So like what are some techniques and strategies that people can do to kind of allow themselves to not be so impulsive in their interactions, and allow for more time to process?
I mean, it may sound a little overused, but taking a timeout. I mean, parents will say that to young children, oh, you need a timeout. We as adults, sometimes we need a timeout. If you're in the middle of a discussion and you notice it's potentially escalating, there's nothing wrong with taking a few seconds and saying, hey, we need to come back to this at a later time. Let's take 10, 20 minutes, process what's going on. That'll give you the time to collect your thoughts and possibly view the situation from a different angle.
Like you mentioned, like owning it. Like if you're in a conversation, something that can't wait, just being like, you know what, like I'm feeling very overwhelmed right now. I just need a minute or two to get my thoughts together, and we'll come back and meet when, emotions aren't as heightened.
Right. We feel it when we feel it when it's starting to escalate. It's now taking that 1 second to go, wait, I need a break from this.
Because I'm wondering too, the opposing end of that, if you don't take a break, like what does that do? Like, that, like you feel this stuff happening into you. People say, oh, I go from 1 to 10 and it just happens. Like, well, there's some time in between 1 and 10. It might be like 0.5 millisecond, but there's still time between 1 and 10. And so I think we're going to get into that a little bit later too. But just like, how do you intercept? Like, yes, we're able to recognize I have these feelings. I'm starting to feel this way. And I know we talk about like taking a time out, but what do we do in that time out to help regulate and bring our stress levels back down?
I think one of the big things that can come to mind that can be helpful is just taking a deep breath, or maybe going for a walk, maybe going outside, especially as we're recording this, it's almost winter, it's cold outside. So that change of temperature, right? Anything that gets us grounded back into the present space that engages our senses, right? That could be various breathing techniques, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method of engaging your senses. What are 5 things you see, 4 things you hear, that kind of thing. Allowing yourself to just pause and turn down the volume on what you're feeling. I think sometimes there is a perception that makes it difficult in those moments because we are feeling such strong emotions, and there's a reason for that. As we talked about, there may be past perceptions of things like that. And so understanding that's truly what's happening, right? There is that emotional response. I think sometimes also understanding it can be difficult because if we're taking a moment, maybe that means like we're invalidating what we're feeling sometimes, or there's that perception of that. When really we're not trying to invalidate it. We're just trying to give ourselves the space enough, whether that's through breathing and things like that we've talked about, or other grounding techniques. YouTube also is a good place to find some breathing techniques or meditation or other strategies like that. But it allows enough time for the volume to turn down on those emotions where we can actually reactivate that more logical thinking part of our brain to address the situation and respond at hand. So we're trying to acknowledge what we're feeling, but also give ourselves some time to think through what we're feeling so we can re-engage with problem solving, whatever the issue may be.
And I'm also wondering too if it's important to have a conversation about, like you mentioned, you're not avoiding it or you're not invalidating, you're just taking a time to recognize what you're feeling. And if people struggle with that, like where's the fine line? Like where's the balance between regulating and avoiding or suppression of emotion?
I think for me, one of the things I would think about is, are we able to come back to that? Like if someone says something or does something or we're emotionally activated, do we just push that to the side and not address it? Pretend like everything's okay when we walk away? Or do we choose to re-engage and address it? Or do we choose to just distract and cope with it in other means that maybe aren't as helpful in addressing that, instead just kind of pushing the feelings to the side?
And are we allowing ourselves to truly identify the emotion? Because some people might think, no, I'm alpha male stereotypes, whatever you can put in your mind, that I only express happy or angry because there is nothing else. That's not true. We are human and we all have the same emotions. And it actually takes more strength to acknowledge that and be able to express that.
Also, too, I'm wondering if you feel like you're stuck or you feel like the feelings that you have in your brain, like we talked about, like based on past experiences, if you're feeling that you're stuck between like, I'm only happy, mad, or sad, like those are the only emotions that I'm able to identify. A good resource to use is the feeling wheel. You can Google that and you can have feelings wheel. And so maybe you look at that. And so maybe you're feeling these certain feelings and they're new to you, but you're not happy, you're not sad, you're not angry, you're in between somewhere. So it's also teaching yourself that there are other feelings that I'm allowed to feel and that I do feel. And I also wonder if that helps to understand behavior and how to respond appropriately. So now that we've acknowledged how past experiences and learned observations influence the way that we respond or influence how we can respond, how do we prevent that from happening when we're dealing with conflict with other people?
I think a first good step would be thinking that there is likely a miscommunication or misunderstanding, or maybe you're not perceiving it the way it was intended. And this goes back to the black and white thinking of, if someone said something and upset me, oh, they absolutely had to have done it to upset me, when in reality, they may have misspoke or didn't realize that the way they said it came off as offensive to you. And when that happens, if you go down the negative thinking, you think, okay, this was intentional. And then if you're responding immediately, it's not logical, it's the emotional reaction. And then you're potentially going to say something that will escalate the situation.
And so with that, to prevent that from happening in those moments, that's why the pause that we've talked about before, giving ourselves a timeout or however we want to put it, giving ourselves a break, is so important in allowing us to be able to step away for a moment and then be able to think through, okay, what is my perception of the event? And then what might be causing my reaction? What is my understanding of what's happening? Sometimes it could be, this is a past experience coming up, or someone said something similar to me before or whatever, and that's bringing up what I'm feeling. Or sometimes it's, for example, for a college student, maybe it's finals week and I'm really stressed out, so I'm already kind of tapped out, or not getting enough sleep or anything like that. And so I'm already more likely to respond in a more emotionally elevated, fired way. And so I think an important question is to be able to ask yourself, what are you needing in the moment? That can be helpful. Is it that you need to go address the conflict at hand? Like maybe they did do something that upset you, talk that through. Maybe it is, okay, that isn't typically how I'd respond to that situation because I'm stressed out or I need some sleep, or maybe even just food and some water, or to get some exercise, whatever that might look like, to help calm that response down and then re-engage in resolving the issue. And sometimes it's hard to resolve those situations, right? You're both emotionally escalated. So maybe sometimes it's, okay, I need to take a break. Maybe I need an exit strategy when I try to re-engage with the individual, if they're not in a place where we can re-engage and attend to the conflict in a helpful way.
And it's almost like you mentioned, like are they able or are they in a space to re-engage? But I also think it's important for the individual to ask himself, like, am I? If we're amidst finals week and I'm worried about my classes and my projects and exams, like, do I have the mental capacity to deal with this right now? And like, what does it look like to, it's going to be different for everybody, but like, what does it look like to wait to have these conversations until, our stress response is not actively being triggered and we're not irritable or irritated by just like the smallest things? Because I also imagine college students finals week, there's lack of sleep there. And that's a whole other topic for a conversation for a different topic. But a lot of things can happen when there's lack of sleep. It affects mood. We won't get too much into it, but there are a lot of variables there. And Kevin, you mentioned something about like the miscommunication piece. And so in the ever-evolving world of technology, it's very easy for words to get misconstrued because people can only see what it's written and not how it was intended or delivered.
Right. Basically, we have 4 forms of communication now, between text, actually speaking on the phone, or using video call, or in person. Regardless of which one is being used, it is possible to have miscommunication, especially when you go to texting. You do not know how that message was intended when it was sent, but you can very easily assume it was negative. And that's the same for any form of communication. That's why the best form of communication typically is in person. You get to read their body language and hear the tone in their voice. And it's much more difficult to misunderstand when you're communicating face to face.
And I think also, depending on the individual, which I say a lot, or you hear me say a lot, just because everything is very subjective. But the way that we use these different means of communications are based on personal value. And so essentially what that means is individuals that value or focus on grammar are going to include proper punctuation in text messages. And I know with certain people, like, proper punctuation in a text message is an absolutely, like, you don't do that. Like, if there is a period at the end of a sentence, like, oh my gosh, this person's mad at me, they don't normally do this, this is a change of behavior. But we don't know what they were doing when they sent that text message. Like, it could have been a speech to text and it just like automatically did it. And so it's so easy for things to get misinterpreted based on what we're just seeing. Because again, we all have different perceptions, different lived reality, different experiences. And is this triggering something from a past relationship?
Right. You have to take all of these things into consideration because, again, especially through text, you don't know what the sender intended in that message. You're just seeing the words.
And I know that we've talked a lot about how the body can influence reactions, and we've talked about impulsive reactions and some ways that we can normalize that or prevent it from escalating to just things that how we've operated before. I wonder if the opposite side of that is like, let's talk about thoughtful communication and what does that look like?
So I guess if you were to receive a text from somebody and there was a period at the end of the sentence and that is so outside of normal for them, your first thought might be, oh my God, they're mad at me. Okay, maybe first thought wrong. Think to yourself, have I said or done anything that would have upset this person? If you can truly say, no, I really don't think I have, okay, then you might just be misinterpreting the text. So then take it at its core value, what the words in the text are.
And I think another piece of that is, again, thinking through if you can think of anything you've done that might have caused that response from that person, but also going or recognizing you don't have all the information yet, right? And so sometimes it might be a simple, if you're wanting to respond, saying, hey, is everything good? Or acknowledging that in a more open-ended way rather than in that emotional state saying, you're mad at me or firing off perhaps a passive-aggressive response or something like that, right? So trying to give them the benefit of a doubt, giving yourself a moment to calm and find out more information before trying to go down the rabbit hole of assumptions can help with creating opportunities for more thoughtful communication.
I know we've talked about taking breaks, stepping away, having those exit strategies, owning it. Like, yes, I'm overwhelmed right now and I just need a break. Like, what would a thoughtful response look like in resolving like the resolution with an individual in person?
Well, if it started out through text and you feel like the situation could potentially escalate, is there a need to even respond? Or if you do respond, have it be, hey, I'm actually going to see you in about 2 hours. Let's talk about this in person. That will, one, it's not you ignoring the text. Two, it gives you time to process things, collect your thoughts. 3, it gives the other person that same opportunity.
Absolutely. And then once you've given them, yourselves both, that opportunity, right, to respond to it, but also allowing some time to think it through, thinking through some of the breathing techniques, things like that you've talked about, keeping in mind, working with your current state, not the story that it's trying to tell you, right? Not the history that tends to come up with that, right? So working with how you're feeling in that moment, focusing on immediate sort of regulation. We can't change other people's responses, right? So maybe, as Kevin said, maybe they respond to that 2 hours message saying, no, I want to talk about it now. That's okay. You do have the opportunity to not engage with that, and then you can re-engage when you see them later. Creating some of those boundaries and making thoughtful decisions about how you want to respond, regardless of how the other individual responds too. Sometimes there might be strategies that, especially in our very close personal relationships, where that you can talk about when things aren't emotionally elevated, I should say. Strategies that you can talk about ahead of time. So that might look like, hey, we have a code word set up that we know, okay, if someone says that code word, we know what that means. Even if they're not able to articulate it in the moment, that means, hey, I need some space. I'm overwhelmed, or I just need a break. We'll get back to this conversation later, right? And talking about some of those strategies ahead of time can also be helpful in addressing potential conflict.
And this is something that I wanted to touch on when we were talking about this earlier. But if we're talking about past experiences, learned observations, this is what we've conditioned our response to be. It's going to take time for you to adapt a different response. And I think that's okay. And I think people are, especially, maybe I'm just making assumptions, but I think when we want to try something new, like we're so excited about it, or we think that like the first time that we do it, it's going to be perfect. But that's not the reality of the situation. It's like, if we're talking about muscles, like if you're trying to build muscles, like it's a continued repetition. So allowing yourself, like, yes, like I think recognizing and acknowledging is a great first step with anything, but specifically with this, like recognizing where your feelings are coming from, having that underlying of like the biological component of stress, recognizing how you normally respond. Those are small baby steps. And I'll speak for myself, like with the work that I do with my clients, if you guys want to add on as well. But I always have my clients, like we work in baby steps, because if we have this big goal, like, okay, it's great to have those goals, but like, if we're going to change behavior, specifically talking about changing behavior, it's not going to happen overnight. What small steps can we take that over time are going to build up to this big goal? And I think that can be correlated to what we're talking about in terms of like changing our reaction and being more thoughtful.
Right. And I would also say, as you're attempting to make these positive changes, remember you're human. We make mistakes. We have bad days. Don't focus on, oh, today was a failure because I did it poorly. Look back at it and look how many times you've done it the right way or the better way. You're making progress every time you make an attempt to do things better.
So it's like reframing the thought.
Right.
Exactly. I think one of the ways that I try to frame it in my work with clients is, we're not looking for perfection here. We're looking to get it right more often than we get it wrong, right? So can we acknowledge the progress, as Kevin said, as you both said, that's being made, and that we are humans, we're going to make mistakes. And also thinking about it in terms of, sometimes I describe it as we're creating a whole new sort of highway, right? We've had this one route in our brain of how we responded to things, how we've done things in the past, but we're trying to build a new highway around that. So it's going to take time for us to get used to that new mode of travel. Consistency is key in trying to practice that, but it's also going to take time, and it's not always going to be perfect. That's okay.
In terms of the conflict, if we're having conflict, or I don't even want to call it conflict, if we're having in person, these are reactions are arising in person, like another way to deal with that is, people don't like conflict. It's just, people don't like it. People are uncomfortable with it. And the way that I, approach it with my clients is I tell them, I said, just notice an observation, because that's just, it's a fact. Like, and I know, like, we have also talked about this, like those I feel statements. So it's more so of, it's subjective. It's about me. It's not like I'm putting the blame on somebody else. And so, like, if you're observing a change, or if you're observing something that's of abnormal behavior to somebody else that, you're friends with, or your roommate or your partner, like, I'm noticing X, Y, and Z. So it opens that conversation for a less confrontational approach. And it's just more so of, hey, like, I'm noticing this. Maybe they don't want to talk about it. But now that this person knows that you're noticing a change in behavior, and maybe when they're ready, they'll approach you.
So maybe when we respond impulsively, it's because we're not thinking logically, and probably the majority of the time it's a misperception of what was said or done.
I think it's important for young adults to recognize that this is a stage of life where you're learning and developing communication skills to help manage conflict and miscommunication. And that's not always easy. It can be extremely uncomfortable. You might even avoid it. But at the end of the day, it's something that is unavoidable. And so what do we do with that?
Right. And like you said, I don't think it's always about conflict necessarily. It could just be a miscommunication or a misunderstanding. And if you respond quickly based on what you felt from that, that's being impulsive. But if you take just that few seconds, you can then practice thoughtful communication and maybe remember to look at whatever was said or texted to you from a different perspective. Could the other person possibly be thinking? Generally, people are assuming the worst. They assume everyone is thinking negative things about me. Well, if everyone is walking around thinking everyone's thinking negative thoughts about me, then it's not possible for everyone to be thinking negative thoughts about you, thinking the same for themselves.
The spotlight effect.
Yes. Perfect. Yes. Maybe it's healthier and safer to make the assumption that they are not intentionally saying or texting something to upset you.
I agree. I think it's giving yourself the moment to recognize and practice that reframing, like you're saying. If it's this perception, maybe everything feels negative, right? Or we assume the worst when that's not always the case. And so by giving yourself the opportunity to practice some of these skills, you can really avoid or
Prevent.
lessen the risk or the opportunity for conflict and other things to arise simply by taking that moment, recognizing kind of what's going on, what's your perception of it, and trying to regulate yourself first before addressing whatever it is at hand that's causing that situation, that response in the body.
I mean, because we are humans, and the biological component of stress, like, that's going to happen regardless of the stage of life that we're in. And so it's figuring out, again, subjectively, like, what works best for you, whether that's breathing techniques, grounding techniques, whether you have exit strategies. And it might take time. It probably will most likely take time, but don't let that discourage you. We talked about a lot today. We talked about the impact that stress has on the body and the biological components in response of that. We talked about the differences between reactive impulse and thoughtful communication, talked about some techniques that we can use to help regulate and help identify and own, when we feel certain things start to, or familiar feelings start to arise in our body based on past experiences, learned observations. And so I'm wondering for the both of you, like, what were some major takeaways?
I think one of the key things that it's important to highlight in all of this that we talked about is that we're going to have that response, right? We're human beings, as you said. It's a normal response. The key is trying to practice how we respond to that when it happens and finding ways that work for the individual on addressing that in healthy ways. Finding those boundaries, those ways that you can address that with any individual, right? Even if they're not responding in the way that you hope that they would. But knowing that that's okay. If they don't respond to it that way, there's still things you can do for yourself to manage it. The key is finding what works for you to address these situations when they happen.
And that makes me think about, because if this is something that people are doing for the first time, like the empty chair technique, or like talking to yourself in the mirror. I know it might sound a little, what's the word I'm looking for?
It might sound
odd.
A little odd. And imagining yourself standing in front of a mirror and trying to say things that you've conditioned yourself not to believe. But what would happen if you started your day every morning? You stood in front of that mirror and said 5 positive things about yourself. You'd start your day with a positive mindset instead of assuming there are so many negative things about yourself. And this would take time. This should be a daily thing.
That's a wrap on the Mind Over Chatter podcast. To our listeners, we are glad you joined us. To our guest, thank you for your time and expertise. Stay up to date on all things Counseling Center related. Follow us on Instagram at CMU Counseling. Check out the Counseling Center website, council.cmich.edu. For counseling services, CMU students can call 989-774-3381 or request an appointment on our website. For other Mind Over Chatter podcast episodes, visit the Mind Over Chatter podcast tab on the Counseling Center website. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.